In this video, we are going to talk about reflection of graphs about y-axis and x-axis. First, we will discuss about reflection about y-axis. So, let's say we have a graph y equal to f of x and we want to reflect it about y-axis. Now, before we reflect a graph about y-axis, let's just reflect one point about y-axis. For example, there is this point in the plane. It has coordinates x and y. Now, if we reflect this point xy about y-axis, so what would happen? First of all, this point xy would see itself, let's say, on the other side of y-axis at this point. Means, from the y-axis, it will cover the same distance as this distance x, but since it is on the other side of y-axis, so it has covered, let's say, minus x distance. And what at this point, what is the height? The height is still the same, which is y. So the coordinates of this point here would be minus x y. So what we are trying to say here is, when we reflect the point xy about y-axis, its reflection is minus x y. Means y remains unchanged and x is changed into minus x. So for reflection of the graph y is equal to f of x, we will replace x by minus x. That's it. Let's have a look at the graph. So let's say we have this curve and we want to reflect it about y-axis. Let's say if a point is here, its reflection about y-axis will be here. Means the height will remain same, but this point will move on the other side of y, which is here. Let's say this point, for this point the reflection would be this, for this point the reflection would be this. So every time we are simply changing x as minus x, and then we will get this curve, which is the reflection of this curve. So this curve is the reflection of this curve about y-axis. So let's look at a curve y equal to x plus 2, and if we have to reflect it about y-axis, so we know the rule that we will have to replace x by minus x. If it is so in this curve we will change x by minus x plus 2. So this graph is the reflection of this graph about y-axis. And let's look at another example for reflection of a graph about y-axis. Let's say we have a graph y equal to x square and we want to reflect it about y-axis. So we know the rule that for reflection about y-axis we will have to replace x by minus x. So in this graph, in the place of x we put minus x whole square and we get x square. So the reflection of this graph y equal to x square is again y equal to x square. Why we are getting the same graph? Let's have a look at the graph. We had this curve y equal to x square and we had to reflect it about y-axis. So you can see that the reflection of this part of the curve about y-axis is this one, and now we are going to reflect this part, and this part reflection about y-axis is this part. So even if we reflect this graph about y-axis, we get the same shape. So that's why mathematically in this case we got the same graph back. Okay, so now let's have a look at the reflection of a graph about x-axis. So we have a graph y equal to f of x and we want to reflect it about x-axis. So let's say we have an xy plane. Okay, so here is this point. Let's take this point roughly. Let's say this is 1 and this is, suppose it is 2. So the coordinates of this point are 1, 2. Now we want to reflect this point about this axis. So reflection of this point 1, 2 means this point would see itself on the other side of x-axis. So it is this. It would see itself here. So to come from 1, 2 to this point, how much height is covered down below? So it had to come to -2 and -2. So this point is -2, but the x has remained unchanged. So now we know that if we are going to reflect a point about x-axis, x remains unchanged but y is changed with -y. So we will say that for reflection about x-axis, replace y with -y. So once we do that, whole graph will be reflected about x-axis. Let's try an example. We have a graph y equal to x plus 2. So we want to reflect it about x-axis. We know the rule that replace y with -y. So in this graph, y becomes -y, x plus 2. We will take minus sign over there. So this is what we get, -x -2. So that is the reflection of this graph y equal to x plus 2 about x-axis. Let's try one more example. We have a graph y equal to x square and we want to reflect it about x-axis. So now we know the rule that if we want to reflect a graph about x-axis, we will have to replace y with -y. So in this graph, when we replace it with -y, we get this, and one more step of simplification gives us y equal to -x square. This is how we reflect a graph about x-axis. We can try one more example. If we have, let's say, x cube minus y plus 1 equal to 0, this is some graph in xy plane. So if we want to reflect it about x-axis, we will have to replace y with -y. So in this equation, if we replace y with -y, we will have x cube plus y plus 1. So that's the reflection of the graph about x-axis. So what we have seen is we can reflect a graph mathematically about y-axis and x-axis, and also geometrically. For example, let's say we have this graph and we want to reflect it about about x-axis. So reflection of this graph about x-axis geometrically, so that would be the reflection of this graph about x-axis. And let's have a look at one more graph. So here we are just reflecting the graphs geometrically. So in the above you have seen us reflecting the graphs mathematically. So if you have to reflect the graph about x-axis, replace y with minus y, and if you have to reflect the graph about y-axis, replace x with minus x. So again we have this graph, and now this time we want to reflect it about y-axis. So reflection of this graph about y-axis is this. So we will reflect it about y-axis, it would be this shape. So that's the reflection of this graph about y-axis. So we have seen how to reflect the graphs about y-axis and x-axis both geometrically and mathematically. In the next video we are going to talk about symmetry of the graphs about x-axis, symmetry of the graphs about y-axis, and symmetry about origin.